Morning. Today is Wednesday, the 6th of Tammuz, June 16th. We're studying the Talmud, the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently studying Maseches Shabbos, chapter 5, page 56a. We are at the tail end of our chapter, and Be'ezer Hashem, today or tomorrow, we'll start a new chapter. More exciting subjects. Today we're continuing our discussion of yesterday, in which we're discussing, we're in the middle of a long conversation about a series of great tzaddikim and people that are in the Tanakh, recorded in the Tanakh as having made a variety of terrible mistakes. And the Gemara provides context and sometimes reintroduces the story. And it's a series of teachings that start with Kol Omer, character, whoever, chata, eino elato, it would be a mistake to assert that they've sinned. In each of these instances thus far, and we'll continue, Rashi reminds us that we're not necessarily making the case, and this is clear from the Gemara, that these people were, at least for the most part, perfect. There may be some kind of shortcoming that the Gemara would agree with. However, the most egregious form of sin, or the definition as it's presented, is not entirely so. And so yesterday we discussed the famous story of David and Bathsheba, and we explored it from a variety of lenses to see that although certainly it was not a great story, it's quite possible that some of the worst allegations, the worst sins may have not been committed based on some technical and important details to consider, such as, was this woman actually halachically married? Was the husband anyways deserving of the death penalty? And so it's quite possible that the mistakes that were made were not quite to the same degree as an early and easy reading of the case was. And so that was the gist of yesterday's Gemara. I mentioned at the end of the class that before we go on to the next segment, which is going to be about King Shlomo, well, actually, no, we're going to finish up about David HaMelech. There's another episode that we're going to see today, and how David HaMelech interacts with the son of his dear friend, Jonathan, famous dear friend of David HaMelech. So he dies in battle with his father Shaul, and his son Mephibosheth has some complex interactions with David HaMelech, and that will be the next topic we bring up. Then we'll go on to Shlomo HaMelech and beyond. But any comments or anything that we left out or didn't have a chance to address yesterday, now would be a good time to bring them up. Reb Beryl Schuster, you go first.
No, I'm troubled by the death of the child. Does anybody have a vote on that? What is the child? We had a whole discussion before whether you're responsible, the parents to the child to the parents, and here we just let it go by.
So we first of all, the Gemara doesn't discuss it. So it's an important question, but it's secondary to the Gemara. It's primary to the study of the chapter in Tanakh in the book of Shmuel. It's actually part of what the prophet tells David HaMelech, right? We reviewed it in the text to review the story, and he says as a punishment, this child is not going to survive. So the question you're asking is, is it ever the case that a parent would be punished with the death of an unborn child or an infant child? Big question, important question, and certainly one that we wouldn't do justice if I try to give you some kind of half answer. It's a big question, but apparently there may be it might be possible that a young child could, certainly in this case, be part of a punishment for the parents' misdeeds. Particularly, this child was a result of the very union that we're discussing. Good question. I'm going to punt on that. Any other important comments we need to bring up? What I would suggest, Beryl, and we could do this another time, is we could go back to the chapter in Tanakh, not in the Gemara here, study it and look at all the commentaries, and a lot of the questions and ideas that we haven't fully addressed are going to be brought up by a variety of commentaries, and there's a lot of material on that. And some of the commentaries, or much of the comments, will be based on our Gemara and a Gemara in Sanhedrin, and a few other places in the Talmud where this episode is discussed as well. Anyone else?
It's also, if nobody else has a question.
Hold on. Dr. Hammer, you know you just muted yourself, right? Okay, fine.
I'll see to the Levi.
No. I thought he was saying something, but go ahead, Beryl. Go ahead.
No, the other thing that we're seeing is the fact that nobody's perfect. We all know that, but I think it's important in a sense that the Gemara is teaching us that it's okay to look at these things. In other words, the simplest thing would be in any other tradition, ignore the thing. Why go deeper? I think there's an important lesson in saying it's okay to question, it's okay to look at these imperfect human beings, if for lack of a better phrase.
Ishkoyach. Should we continue in someone's going to point out that actually our Gemara, that would be a comment on the Tanakh. Our Gemara is making the case that lo chata,
Right.
the sin is not as so. The Tanakh, there are certain, as I was doing a little bit of research and reading up on the subject, because this is one of the big topics in the people always ask. So there are a whole variety of nuanced ways to understand the story and what this Gemara is doing. Suffice it to say that the Gemara, as we're presenting it, is saying that David HaMelech, while it wasn't great, is certainly not the same degree as if he'd done everything as it's simply presented. And to add, as I mentioned yesterday, that David HaMelech actually knew, that he was destined to marry this woman. The mistake was the process was meant to be a drop longer than it took, and that's where the trouble is. Let's share the screen and let's continue our Gemara while we load, because for some reason Safaria needs to be reloaded here. Any final comments are welcome.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Rebberal is being too broad. Throughout the Chumash, we find that the Avot are not perfect, but when it comes to something like this, and we try to somehow justify it,
We're not justifying it. We're contextualizing.
it's not so bad. That's no. That we're not trying to justify it, but we're ultimately trying to say that that our leaders can be imperfect.
Yeah.
But the question is how imperfect.
So the Gemara is saying that David HaMelech avoided textbook adultery. That's what the Gemara is saying.
Okay, so in today's world, okay, again, we always talk about you have to put everything in the context of when it happened, everything. This would not fly in today's world, period. Okay, we've seen it in all sorts of ways, not just with politicians, but with religious leaders and with educators, et cetera, et cetera. So I have a hard time with trying to rationalize that it was there put here for a very good reason, and it taught us that we're not all perfect human beings in our behaviors.
Thank you.
We've gone the other way, Dr. Bernie. We've gone today. The accusation is enough to get you strung up.
I would be hesitant to overly celebrate or over decry modern society. Baruch Hashem, there's awareness that didn't exist, and Baruch Hashem, there are many events and episodes and individuals, abusers that are being reined in. But I'm afraid it would be naive to assume that most people that are most perpetrators have actually been found and properly dealt with.
I'm not assuming that at all.
And on the flip side, Roberto is correct that sometimes innocent people are also being tarred and feathered in the attempt. And I guess the reality is that the perfect balance of creating a safe and moral society is hard and ongoing and imperfect. But Baruch Hashem for the awareness. All right, let's see the Gemara.
I have a question also.
Oh, I'm sorry. Reb Allen, we don't see you, so go ahead.
I lost my face.
Well, we lost your face. I hope you don't lose your face.
No. Was this the same son who killed another friend of his and ran off to stay with his grandfather and then came back and tried to take over the throne?
No, the son in this story did not survive.
Okay. So he had Surus with another son
but
too.
We're actually going to see in the next part of the Gemara a reference to that story. So,
Okay.
Reb Allen, as always, you're on target. Amar Rav. So Rav commented along the theme of the misdeeds that are portrayed in the Tanakh of David HaMelech. And again, the big question is, and I know it with a modern lens and with the literal reading of the text, we're uncomfortable, and I know we might be uncomfortable with an attempt to rehabilitate, but ultimately, the way the Gemara understands this, that David HaMelech was a great person, and there were other forces and other issues at play that are relevant to take into account for the totality of David HaMelech, particularly because had there been a textbook adultery or had there been a textbook murder, and again, so with all the acknowledgments and the what's the word, disclaimers, well then David HaMelech would not have continued to be David HaMelech, and he wouldn't be the progenitor, the grandfather of Mashiach, and he wouldn't be the person that we're reading his Tehillim. And ultimately, the Torah and Hashem through the prophets that write the book of Shmuel, ultimately, the book of Melachim, or Shmuel rather, ultimately the testimony is that David HaMelech was a tzaddik, and that is the Jewish tradition. We need to accept it. And so the Gemara is trying to make sense of how that could work. How would the Tanakh testify that he's a tzaddik? How would David HaMelech be the father of all the future kings of Yehuda? How would Mashiach want to come from him and want to come from him? And so to do that, we need to understand, and the Gemara makes the strong case that David HaMelech, although certainly there were mistakes, and certainly the Navi admonishes him, and David HaMelech does teshuvah, and there is a teshuvah, but it's important to understand who David HaMelech was and who he wasn't, and that's part of the process that this Gemara and other Gemaras are taking part of. And with that, the Gemara now continues and quotes Rav along the same subject. When we look into the story of David, Loi mishkachas bei bar mid Uriah, we find no other crime, no other sin, besides for the story of Uriah, being put to death, notwithstanding the treason, but the way it was done, that is the problem. We didn't make this up. The Gemara doesn't make it up. The Gemara looks into Tanakh in the Book of Kings and reads about Shlomo HaMelech. And then the grandson of Shlomo HaMelech. And there's a line that says, let's just read this line. It's for the sake of David, Leman David, the Lord his God gave him a lamp in Jerusalem by raising up his descendants after him and preserving Jerusalem. For David had done what was pleasing to the Lord and never turned throughout his life from all that he had commanded him, except in the matter of Uriah. So the Tanakh says that everything else was perfect, besides for the story of Uriah, which we just addressed. If you're curious, commentaries, I'll jump in over here. Let's just peek for a moment. And so the Abarbanel quotes the Gemara, which says that ultimately the main problem was the death of Uriah. Rashi, Mikra ksiv kach b'dvar Uriah shegarm lo sheyahareg, aber b'vas sheva lechata. He did sin by having Uriah killed, even though a king has a certain expanded latitude when it comes to the life and death of his subjects in the biblical times and in the time of David HaMelech. Whereas with Bathsheba, again, there was no textbook sin, there was no textbook crime because of our discussion and all the details that we said about the fact that she was ultimately divorced, she was not a married woman, etc., etc. The Gemara is going to challenge this assertion, which again is based on the Tanakh, based on the Melachim Aleph, in the narrative describing the grandson of David HaMelech Rechav. So Abaya Keshisha Ramei Rav Rav. Abaya Keshisha has a challenge, has a problem, and found a contradiction with the two statements of Rav. What are the two statements of Rav? Well, Rav just said that David HaMelech had a perfect record with just one dismerit. But Miyamar Rav Hachi, did Rav really say that? Amar Rav also commented and said, Kibel David Lashon Hara. He also made a comment saying that David HaMelech accepted Lashon Hara. He listened and accepted Lashon Hara, and as we know, Jewish tradition. Lashon hara is not a good thing to do. And we have a testimony, we have evidence that he accepted Lashon hara. And Rashi right away says, don't get nervous. The Gemara is going to elaborate. Gufa, here is the story of Lashon hara and David HaMelech. And it's ultimately going to lead to the story, or at least a reference to the story of Avshalom, the rebellion of David's son, which Rabbi Alan Nash, the faceless. Rabbi Alan, I hope you find your face because we love to see it. Gufa, here is the comment of Rav. Rav Amar, Rav taught, Kibel David Lashon hara. Rav is arguing with others, but he says that David HaMelech received, he accepted, he listened and believed Lashon hara. What's the story? So the story is as follows. Following the fall of Shaul and Jonathan, David HaMelech is hunting, searching for the survivors of Jonathan. Let's actually see if we can pull up the story inside. And he's interviewing Siva, who was a slave of the house of the family of Shaul. And he asks, where is here, chapter 9. You just lost over here. Hold on. Here. No, this is chapter 8. Don't get dizzy. Hold on tight. We're almost there. David now wants to know if there are any survivors to the house of Jonathan, his good friend. And so the Tanakh tells us, I'm just doing this briefly so we can recognize and understand the Gemara. In the house of Shaul, there was a servant called Tziva, and he was summoned to David HaMelech. And the king said to him, are you Tziva, the famous servant of Shaul? And he said, yes, I am. So the king said, is there anybody left in your master's house that I could do them kindness? I could make things right. Again, David HaMelech didn't kill them. The Philistines did. But yet David HaMelech wants to look after them. And so the servant says, yes, your friend Yonasan had a crippled son who survived. So the king says, where can I find him? And so the slave Siva says, he's presently holed up in the house of Machir, son of Amiel, below Davar, in a place called Lo Davar, and the Gemara is going to analyze what this place Lo Davar is. So the king summoned him, and he came. Mephibosheth was this grandson of Shaul. Arrives to David, he falls on his face, he prostrates, and David says, are you Mephibosheth? And he says, yes. So David says, don't worry, I'll be good to you because of your father. I'll give you back your estates that belong to your grandfather, and you'll be welcome at my table. And he said, thank you. And then he speaks humbly, acknowledging the kindness of the king. And the king calls Siva and says, I'm going to give to you everything that belonged to Shaul, etc., etc. We'll see the Gemara. Basically, eventually, the king decides to give whatever he was going to give to Mephibosheth to the slave, and Mephibosheth was not happy about it. And
somebody has to be muted, Rabbi. There's a lot of noise in the background.
Here, let me see. All right, let's see if that helps. All right, this is the book of Shmuel briefly summarized. There's a lot of in between the lines that you wouldn't necessarily notice, and that's the Gemara going to discuss. That is what the Gemara is going to discuss. So the story is, David HaMelech is interviewing the slave. You could find him in the house of Machir, son of Amiel, below Davar. What is Loi Davar? Rashi says, he really is a nobody. He's a Loi Davar. He's a zero. He's a nobody. Rashi says he's not Torah knowledgeable. And Rashi says, in truth, he was a very knowledgeable person. And then it says he brought him from Miloi Davar. Look at something very interesting. You see the words? It says Biloi Davar or Miloi Davar. Biloi means without, but Miloi could be very close to the word Malay, full. So Loi Davar, nothing, Maloi Davar, full of stuff. Mechti Chazi the Shakrahu. So David should have noticed that this slave, Tziva, is a liar. Why? Because he alleged that Mephibosheth is a nobody, and he turned out to be quite a somebody. So the second time around, when Tziva tries to badmouth his master or his master's son, why was David HaMelech willing to accept his comments? What was the Lashon Hara? Do me a favor, tell me, am I going too fast? Should I slow down the pace, or is the pace okay?
Everything's fine.
Okay, I just want to make sure, because usually it's a story, so it's flowing more. So I just want to make sure we're not going too fast. So what was the second instance where King David accepts Lashon Hara? The king sees the slave and says, "Hey, where's your boss? Or where's your master's son?" He says, the slave says he's in Jerusalem. So what's wrong about that? I'll tell you what's wrong about that. Well, let's see Rashi. My time accompanied me. What happened is there was a very tragic event in David HaMelech's life. His son, Avshalom, ends up rebelling against David HaMelech. He wants to be crowned the king, and he finds support. He finds support among some of the people, even some of the machers. Apparently, this son, Avshalom, was a very charismatic person. Avshalom remains in Jerusalem, and David HaMelech is on the run. And so, for the slave to say, you know where the guy you're looking for, you know where Mephibosheth is? He's hanging out in Jerusalem. What he's saying is, he's hanging out with your enemies, and he's hoping. Rashi says, "Ki Amar Hayoim Yoshivu Li as Amleches Avi." Maybe I'll get back my kingdom, because let's see. Let me just see if we can pull up the story. All right, we're doing too much profits. Let's see. Okay, this is the story of Avshalom. It's Shmuel Beis, and it's chapter. Was it 13? No, let's see. And this is this. I'm sorry. I'm scrolling through. He declares a rebellion. All right, I'm getting dizzy, so I'm gonna have to stop. We'll just use the Gemara's version. So he's basically saying he's holed up in Jerusalem. Maybe he's even hoping that he'll get his own kingdom restored, because if the father and son are fighting, then maybe Mephibosheth can step into the void and declare and become a king. And so imagine you're on the run, you're already experiencing a treasonous rebellion, and someone tells you that this person, the son of your friend, who you're really treating very nicely, and is your ally, is actually looking to be rebellious as well. When we know in the Kabul Mineh, how do we know that David HaMelech actually agreed to this allegation? Look at the verse. He tells the slave he can have everything that originally belonged to his master. And so when David HaMelech says, you can now have all that belongs to Mephibosheth, we can read between the lines and understand that David HaMelech accepted the slander that it was treason, because had David HaMelech not accepted that Mephibosheth, the son of Yonasan, grandson of Shaul, was being treasonous, why would David have had a change of heart and given all of the holdings that were meant for Mephibosheth to his slave? So therefore we see that King David HaMelech also had the shortcoming of accepting Lashon Hara when it came to the treatment of Shaul HaMelech's grandson, Yonasan's son, Mephibosheth. That is the opinion of Rav. And that's the contradictory opinion of Rav. On one hand, Rav says David HaMelech only has one sin, the sin of killing Uriah. But we have another teaching of Rav that says that he also accepted Lashon Hara. That's the question, and this is the text that makes that question. Shmuel famously, well, what famously? Because Shmuel is frequently disagreeing with Rav in our Gemara and through Rashas. Shmuel says, Loi kibel David Lashon Hara. In truth, David HaMelech never actually accepted Lashon Hara. So what do we make of this story? Simple. Devarim ani karim chazabe. He heard slander, but that's not what impressed him. He saw evidence that the slander was true. So he wasn't accepting slander. He had other evidence to indicate that Mephibosheth was rebellious. And this is the text I was searching for, but thank God it's hyperlinked. Here we go.
Rabbi,
Yes.
didn't David HaMelech do something else that was very, very bad?
What is
When
that?
he asked his general to go out and kill, and in return, God killed 80,000 people?
I think, are you talking about the story of Shaul, King Saul, who killed a city of priests?
No, I think it was David HaMelech.
I'm not sure. The truth is that it's been a while. We have to review the whole book of Kings and the book of Shmuel. But let's take the Gemara's assertion for now, as is. When you're a king, there are many battles, and when you're running a justice system and whatever the form was, there's going to be lives taken. Not every time that a person died at the hand of the king is considered a crime. The story of Uriah Hittite is considered a crime because it was, well, anyways. So it's a fair question. We can review it later, but for now,
It's a great compliment that we have to look so hard to find Lashon Hara. The rest of us we can find in 2 seconds.
All right, so here let's see how the Gemara explains that it wasn't the Lashon Hara that was impressive. It was the evidence. So here's the story. Mephibosheth, son of Shaul, came to meet the king. V'lo asas raglav, he didn't have a pedicure. V'lo asas v'may, and he didn't trim up. He didn't groom. Yes, begad of lechibis, and he was wearing crumpled, unclean clothing. Limen hayoim leches hamelchad hayoim asher ba b'shalom. He didn't clean his clothing from the day that he left until the day that he came. And when he came from Yerushalayim to meet the king says, "What's going on? Why didn't you come along with me? Are you on my side or are you on the other side?" So he says, "I was tricked. My servants saddled up the animal to ride it. I guess either they didn't take him along or they took him along the way he was." And then he says, "Ziva slain v'yirago ba'avdecha lamelech." The servant spoke poorly about me. He slandered me. But you, in truth, are a wonderful, glorious king. Do as you see, please. So the bottom line is that this is the story. He comes and meets him in a disheveled, disrespectful presentation. He saw that he wasn't treating him with the proper respect of a king, and it was an indicator that maybe he soured on David HaMelech. Rashi. Once King Avshalom was killed, and now King David is back in charge of the country. And he came to greet the victorious king. He didn't groom himself. He didn't put himself together. And it looks like the guy was in mourning that David HaMelech is going to be restored. He didn't get himself all dressed up. He was thinking that when they put me as king, then I'll groom. Until then, I'll just wait. So long story short, David HaMelech saw in his presentation evidence that he was not loyal to him. And so it wasn't the words of Tziva that he accepted, it was the behavior of this individual, Mephibosheth. And he defended himself and said, "Listen, this is nothing personal. I'm handicapped and I'm dependent on my servants. And if they try to mess around, if they don't let me come visit you sooner, I'm very vulnerable and it's only up to them." David HaMelech ends up half accepting his words. He says, okay, well, you're going to still have to split your stuff with your slave. So he doesn't fully restore him. Again, back to the Gemara. Shmuel says, David never accepted Lashon Hara. He saw circumstantial evidence or evidence that he was indeed not fully loyal to him. As the story says, he came ungroomed. And then afterwards it says, Vayiki ba Yerushalayim likras HaMelech. He says, hey, Mephibosheth, I thought we're buddies. I thought we're pals. Why didn't you come with me during this rebellion? He says, I was forced, I was tricked by my servants. That I need them to let me come out, and they didn't take me along for the ride. It's not my fault. Again, this is the text of the Gemara quoting from the book of Shmuel, saying that he says, look, I'm lame. I need my servant's help. Please understand my story, but do as you see fit. And the king responds, no need to defend yourself. By the way, there's a lot of nuanced, passive-aggressive kind of subtle language going on over here. David HaMelech on one hand says, hey, stop defending yourself, it's fine. But he doesn't restore his estate entirely. He's going to still have to split his own family's estate with his slave. Why now you're going to split it. Mephibosheth also is a little bit, let's see. You know what? Don't do him any favors, king. Give it all to the slave. Now that you're back and you're safe, if this is how you're going to do things, do it your way. No need to care for me. Amar Lo, he says, I was davening, I was praying, I was hoping, pining that you would be victorious. This is what you're going to do to your loyal subject who only wanted to see your victory. I'm not upset at you. I'm upset at God for letting you survive this encounter and allowing you to dispense such miserable justice. Again, he doesn't say it in those words, but we have this very complicated, subtle, but very severe dialogue between David HaMelech and the son of his dear friend, Yonasan, where David HaMelech was right for suspecting him because the evidence did point that way. But we see that Mephibosheth had a defense, and it's not entirely clear who was right and who was wrong. I think many of the commentaries understand that Mephibosheth probably wasn't being entirely loyal, and it's just an excuse. When you're the son of the king and you're wealthy and the king hooks you up, if your servants aren't helping you, get another servant. You can figure it out. So I think many of the commentaries seem to be inclined to say that David HaMelech was not wrong in his assessment. By the way, we turn the page now to 56b, Nun Vav Amud Beis, and this is our final drive to finish the chapter. We're not going to finish today based on time, but probably Mirz Hashem by tomorrow. And now that we understand, now that we see that there was this complicated dynamic between Mephibosheth and David HaMelech, and we see that Mephibosheth gave some justification. His behavior backed up the Lashon Hara of Tziva. That's what the verse says. Yonasan, Miriv, Baal. It talks about the son of Yonasan, who was Mephibosheth, and it calls him Miriv Baal. Miriv Baal Shmoi was his name, Miriv Baal. Hala Mephibosheth Shmoi, he was really called Mephibosheth. Elamitoich she'asa Meriva in Baalav, being that he messed with God, he argued with God, complaining for David HaMelech being saved. Yatzasa Baskal v'Amar La, a voice came out and says, Natza bar Natza. Let's see what a Natza is. Fighter, quarrelsome one, son of quarrelsome one. I think the Gemara is saying he had a personality disorder. He's always picking fights. Hadamar. So first of all, he picked a fight with David HaMelech, and he picked a fight with Hashem. He's complaining to Hashem for letting David HaMelech survive, and he's saying it to David HaMelech's face, something's going on over here. And what's Bar Natza? What does it mean that he was the son of someone that was a troublemaker? We find that Shaul also is described as Yarev, fighting, and the Gemara says, Amar Rebbe Mani al Iske Nachal. He came to deal with matters of a nacha. Let's see Rabbi Steinsaltz here. For the murder of a single person, there is a commandment to break the neck of the heifer. Why then must all these Amalekites be killed? All right, so let me explain to you what happened. King Shaul, Rashi explains it, but in much shorter. King Shaul is commanded to kill out all of the people of Amalek, right? And he didn't do quite a perfect job. He left Agag, he left the livestock, but he also argued with Hashem about killing them. And he said, Hashem, I know you. You're really concerned about the death of one person. One innocent life taken is terrible. How could you, Hashem, command me to kill out all the people of Amalek? And so Shaul is arguing with God. His grandson is arguing with God. Rashi, Mal nefesh achas amar Torah, have egla rufa. If one person dies, the Torah says there's a whole protocol to try to identify the murderer. All these people, all of these Amalekites, a lot of lives. You want me to take them? And Mela, you say the adults sinned, okay, but what about the kids? So Shaul had a compelling argument. However, God sees the bigger picture. And when God himself tells you to do something, you better do it. Even if it doesn't make sense. You don't have to like it, but you better listen. And so we see here that Shaul argued with Hashem, and his grandson, Mephibosheth, also is mirabal, saying, Hashem, you had to ruin my day and let David HaMelech be saved. Had he died, had he lost, maybe I'd be the king. And so, all told, we're not giving a glowing report on Mephibosheth relative to David HaMelech. Now here is another tragic event. Ultimately, although we're saying that David HaMelech was not entirely incorrect, and ultimately we're saying that David HaMelech had good basis for his suspicion. Ultimately, the injustice of him telling Mephibosheth that he's going to have to split his own family's estate with his slave led to trouble, led to problems for the Jewish people. And we're about to see a very fascinating series of comments from the Gemara that are very insightful. And let's see. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav Tah. B'shosh Amar David Mephibosheth. When King David told Mephibosheth, Atov etziva tichalko es hasadeh, you too will share your family's estate. Yatzasa bas kol v'amra loy. A voice rang out from heaven and said, Rechavam v'yiravam yichalko es hamelucha. In the age of your grandson Rechavam, the kingdom of Israel will be split in half between Rechavam, son of Shlomo, and Yiravam, son of Nevat, the person representing the kingdom of Israel. This is the tragic story of the breakaway and the fight between the two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. And the Gemara here is saying that it's associated with the fact that David HaMelech unjustly divided the estate of Mephibosheth. Why? Well, David HaMelech took away 50% of what was justly belonging to Mephibosheth, and he loses 50%. Although if we do the math, it could even be more than 50%, kingdom-wise, right? Tribe-wise, it ended up being 2 tribes and 10 tribes. But as far as land mass, whatever the case is, it's Midah Keneged Midah explains the Gemara in another Masechta which discusses this topic. The Maharsha in the other Gemara Numa says that because David HaMelech gave honor and made someone share authority with a slave, David HaMelech's grandson is ultimately going to have to split authority over Israel with Yeravam ben Nevat, who was a servant to King Shlomo. And that is the story. Tragic, Mida Keneged Mida, and of course, a big price, a big cost for the Jewish people. Now, ultimately, this is what was meant to happen. This is part of the story. This is famously the tension that exists between Yehuda and Yosef, and even in the time of the two brothers in the Parsha of Vayigash, we find Yosef and Yehuda facing off, and this is a general theme in Jewish history. But the actual event that led to this, spiritually, we're being told, was this story of David HaMelech forcing Mephibosheth to share his estate. Let's squeeze in a little more Gemara. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Ilmali lo kibel David lashon hara lo nechliku malchus beis David. If not for this event, had David HaMelech not received, accepted, and believed this lashon hara, the kingdom of Israel would not have been split. By that, I just want to remind you. Rav says David HaMelech accepted lashon hara. Shmuel is the one who said that he had evidence. Now we're going back to Rav. Rav says he accepted lashon hara, so it puts David HaMelech in the wrong. Had he not made this mistake, had he not accepted the words of the slave, had he not split the estate of Mephibosheth, the kingdom of Israel would not have been split. And thus, another consequence could have been avoided. What consequence? The Jewish people would not have worshipped Avodah Zarah. And if they had not worshipped Avodah Zarah, like Galino Me'artzeno, they would not have been removed from Israel. What was the Avodah Zarah? Well, the Tanakh tells us that after the breakaway, after the split between the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, Yeravam wanted to prevent people from his kingdom going up to Yerushalayim, because he knew that that would give a lot of influence to the kingdom of Yehuda, and therefore he created Avodah Zarah. He created temples and statues that he insisted his subjects worship in the place of going to Yerushalayim. Rashi. Because the kingdom was split, Hamid Yeravam Agolim. Yeravam placed these calves, and he wanted to prevent the Jewish people from going up to Yerushalayim. And that, of course, led to the spiritual decay of the Jewish people, and it led to eventually being exiled from the land. And as we know, the 10 tribes were exiled before. 2 tribes, the kingdom of Yisrael, Malchus Yisrael, was exiled by Sancheriv, and that's where we have the whole story of the 10 lost tribes. May the whole balance be restored with the arrival of Mashiach speedily. Now let's see the Ben Yoyada. So the Gemara in Erechin says that Lashon Hara has 3 harms, 3 bads. And these 3 damages are alluded to in the word nega. Nega, of course, is the saras, is the malady that happens for speaking Lashon Hara. He says, very interesting. He says there were 3 terrible events that happened because of Lashon Hara. Nega. Nechlok Malchus Beis David, the kingdom of Israel was divided. Golo Yisrael, the Jews went into exile, and Avdu Avodah Zarah. Nun, Gimel, Ayin, Nega, the malady, the impact, the effect of Lashon Hara were these 3 items. Division of the kingdom, exile, and Avodah Zarah. That's a very interesting avart. And that's what David HaMelech was saying when he was in Tehillim, saying chapter 39 of Tehillim, he says, Hasur me'olai nigecha, please Hashem, remove the nega, remove these consequences. Those consequences being all of the effects of accepting this Lashon Hara. When Mashiach comes, we're going to have the opposite. We're going to have the undoing of nega. It's going to become oineg, nega, oineg, the same letters, 2 very opposite words. Nega, skin malady, discomfort and pain, reworked, could spell the word oineg, and that's what we say, hafachta mispidi lamachali, Hashem will transform the mourning into celebration, to song, to dance, and then we'll have a angu al roiv shalom. Mashiach comes, it says we'll have the pleasure of the great peace that is being portrayed. So eventually it's all going to work out and the Jewish people will be restored. But for now, Lashon Hara had terrible consequences, and that's a beautiful drush presented to us by the Ben Yehoyada. Amar Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani. Okay, we're gonna do. I don't want to be false advertising. So this concludes our discussion, our unit about David HaMelech and his shortcomings. We discussed the story of David and Bathsheba. We discussed the Machlokes Rav and Shmuel about if David HaMelech accepted Lashon Hara about Mephibosheth, the son of his dear friend, the surviving heir to King Saul, the first king of Israel. As you can understand, there would have been tension unspoken between the grandson of King Saul, who was David HaMelech's competition and predecessor. If this Mephibosheth could would survive and be a king, that would obviously be a threat to David HaMelech. You can't blame David for being a little bit paranoid or reading deeply into his behavior. Ultimately, there's a Machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Was it just Lashon Hara that led David HaMelech to be paranoid, or did Mephibosheth actually feed that suspicion by his behavior? And this concludes the unit on David HaMelech. But we're not done, because now we're going to talk about David HaMelech's son, King Shlomo. And once again, your mind's likely to be blown as we read this next segment. Amar Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yonasan. Once upon a time, all Jews knew Tanakh very well. And then, for much of, I think, Ashkenazic history, certainly the last few hundred years, certainly in the yeshiva world, for whatever reason, Tanakh was somewhat sidelined. We don't have enough time to discuss why that might have been the case. But interestingly, I think if you read the Gemara, it's not certain that the Gemara expects us to know the entirety of Tanakh by heart. And I'll tell you why. Because the Gemara seems to be filling in a lot of details that if you're a student of Tanakh, you might know anyways. So ironically, this segment of the Gemara telling us about different tales of alleged sins and explaining why they may have not been quite as bad as they're presented is ironically bringing these stories to our attention. But let's see the story. If you're going to allege that Shlomo Melech actually sinned, that would be a mistake. What sin? Rashi right away gives us the heads up. Avodah Zarah, idol worship. Shenemar, where do we see that Shlomo Melech could not have done the sin of idol worship? Because we say, his heart was not as complete with Hashem like his father. Maybe he wasn't quite like his father David. But he certainly did not sin. Therefore, what do we make of, the narrative of the Tanakh that seems to indicate that King Shlomo did some stuff that wasn't quite great? And Lamani Mikayim, what do I make sense of the following verse? Vayihile Zikna Shlomo, in the old age of King Solomon, Nashav Hitu Es Levavai, his wives influenced and turned his heart astray. He turned his heart astray. That sounds like we're talking about Avodah Zarah. And actually, the part that the Gemara doesn't quote is the pasuk continues. Hita es levavai, acharei elokim acherim, to follow foreign gods. To Rav Nosson Rami, and indeed, Rav Nosson grappled with this exact question. See, we have one verse, the one that we just read. Vayihi le'ez zikna Shlomo, nashav hitu es levavai. On one hand, the verse says that his wives pushed him astray after foreign gods. The Aksiv, Kilvav David Aviv. On the other hand, we say that he was a pretty fine guy. He was just a notch below his father. Kilvav David Aviv, he was not a sinner. So what do we make of these two verses? Was King Shlomo a pretty fine guy, or did he do Avodah Zarah? Hachi Kamar. This is how you have to understand the story. They were trying to push his heart astray, but he did not follow their urging, their pushings, and their directions. That would work if there wasn't another verse that seems to indicate that Shlomo did not just experience pressure, but actually acted on it. Where do we see that he acted on the encouragement to do Avodah Zarah? It says, "Az yivna Shlomo bama." Solomon then built a bama, a kind of altar, lichmosh, shikatz or shikutz moav. He built an altar for the god of the Moabites, called Chemosh. Oz Yivna Shlomo, then Shlomo will built an altar to a Moabite avodah zara. That doesn't sound good. So the Gemara says, no, you got to read it again. Shebikesh livnois v'leibana. He was considering it, he was willing to. Ultimately, he did not do so. Now, right away, you're wondering, to even have a thought, a consideration of honoring avodah zara is already a problem. So what do we make of this? Hang on. So the word yibana means in the future, not that he built it, meaning that it could have happened, but it didn't happen. We say machshava ra, bad thought. HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzaref l'maisa. Hashem could consider it as if you've done it. The Gemara in Kiddushin, I'm reading here the footnotes say that having this machshava was already a sin, even if he didn't act on it. The answer is the machshava is only if you actually accept the God as a God. Maybe what happened was they were badgering him, saying, Shlomo, give me your credit card, please. We want to do this. Come on. Eventually, I'll give you the credit card. Go buy whatever you want to buy. He didn't accept avodah zara. He just was dealing with the badgering of his wives. And being that they ultimately didn't act on it, of course, Shlomo didn't really believe in avodah zara. That is a way to understand it. And therefore, he wasn't punished for this. All right, the Gemara has a problem with this, though. Because the Hebrew language can be a funny thing. And when we read a line that says, Oz Yivna Shlomo, although the word Yivna on its own in conversation is that it will be done, the totality of the verse indicates that he did build it, not that he's going to build it. And that's particularly problematic because there's another verse about Yehoshua, and it uses the same words to describe his construction of an altar. And we certainly are not going to assert that he never built the altar, he just wanted to. Elomeata. Let's examine another instance where the same exact formula is used. Az Yivna Yehoshua Mizbeach Lashem. Then Joshua built an altar. Are you going to tell me we need to reinterpret the verse to say Shabikesh Livnas V'Leibana? Joshua was considering building it, but he never did. Eladabana, obviously, he actually built the altar. Hachanami Debana, if that's the case, then Shlomo also built the altar for the Moabite abomination. Elachidetanya. You got to understand the story in the verse as follows. Rabbi Yossi taught. The Esabamais Asher Alpnei Yerushalayim, Asher Mimin Lahar Mishcha, Asher Bona Shlomo HaMelech, LaAshtaros Shikutz Sidonim. The verse says the altars that were before Jerusalem, which were on the right hand of the Mount of Olives, should be familiar to some of us, which Shlomo, king of Yisrael, built for Ashtaroth, which was the Avodah of Sidonim, and for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Mikom, the abomination of Ammon, the king defiled. So, in the book of Malachim Beis, it talks about how Yoshiyahu destroyed I'm sorry. Hold on. Okay, I just lost the place. We're only a few minutes away. So anyway, suffice it to say that over there it talks about how the righteous king destroys these altars, and they are described as having built by Shlomo Melech. Avshar b'Asav Lebiram, Yeshav Lebiram, Achshaba Yoshia Viram. Sorry, King Yoshia. You think the other righteous kings would have allowed altars historically from the time of Shlomo Melech? We have a righteous Yoshaphat, righteous Asa. The earlier kings destroyed them. Rather, here's how you have to understand it. Rashi. Makish has been Yoresh Shlomo leBiurei Shel Yosha. Ma Yoshio lo asa bir zev etolo boy min Hashemayim l'shevach. Hayol vir hashar shenasa mishemeis Yoshavet. Shlomo lo asa being is Shlomo didn't actually build it. However, he's blamed for not, or allowing it to exist. Let's read Rabbi Steindalt as he fills in the blanks. Yoshiyahu or Yehoash did not affect the destruction of the altar. It was done earlier, but he's credited because they're not rebuilt. Shlomo also didn't actually construct them, but he didn't prevent their construction. When you're a king and you have a lot of control and authority and you could tell everyone what to do, the failure to abort, to stop the construction of these mizbechot is already a kind of stain on his reputation. So again, we have two verses that we've dealt with so far. Verse 1 says the wives convinced Shlomo to go after the foreign gods. So he said he wanted to, he didn't do it. But there's another verse that seems like he built altars for the Mizbeach. That would sound like he acted on it. So the Gemara says no. He didn't literally build the altar, but it's still a stain on his reputation because he should have used his code department to stall it forever. Cities know how to do it very well, as I can personally attest. They know how to slow you down. So being the king, he could have slowed it down. He could have made them pull additional permits. He could have made them go for a special variance, and he didn't. And so therefore he is held guilty to that crime. The verse says that he did that. That King Shlomo actually did evil in Hashem's eyes. He had these women in his life. They were not doing the ideal things for someone in the house of Shlomo. And he didn't protest Malav because of Kiluchata. It's as if he actually sinned, because the failure to stop stuff from happening in your own backyard or in your own palace or in your own kingdom, it ultimately, the buck stops for the king. And therefore, Shlomo Melech, just like much earlier on in this Gemara, when this whole Gemara started, we talked about the responsibility of protesting and stopping stuff that are under control. Well, this is a beautiful example or a good instance of the case where Shlomo Melech did not serve idols. He didn't build altars, but he didn't stop it. He didn't protest, and for that he's being tarred, labeled as if he had done so. Tomorrow we're going to continue to dig deep into the family dynamic that existed for King Shlomo. We're going to read about some of the strange things that happened that were done by his wives in the service of Avodah Zarah. And so we're still in the middle of the conversation. I want to thank you all for being here and for joining.
Rabbi, before you dash off, let me leave you with a klutz kasha. How did we move from the cow and the Rishus HaRabim to all this? Is there a connection?
We've asked this question a few times. Remember what happened? What was the cow? What was wrong with the cow? Failure to protest.
The question about protesting.
It was a failure to protest. From the discussion of the failure to protest, we looked at the Tanakh, at the story at Yecheskel, who about the tough, right? The righteous people are punished, and even the wicked people are punished, and even the righteous people are going to be punished as a result of their failure to protest. So then we went off into a broader discussion about the responsibility of protesting and the culpability if we fail to do so. And then once we were on the subject of the consequences of different sins, we're talking about Averot that did and didn't happen, because sometimes the Avera was the failure to protest. We go on to bring a series of, then we spoke about people that were punished only because of the snake, or if they had other kinds of responsibility. And from there, talking about sin and consequence, it was an easy segue to talk about people in Tanakh that are alleged to have sin and really didn't sin to the same degree, but are held responsible to a higher level, akin to those who are held responsible for the failure to protest. And again, it led to the series of rehabilitating, modifying, or clarifying all these stories in the Tanakh. It is the nature of the Gemara to allow, when the Gemara has certain things that it wants to share with us, it is within the nature and an acceptable and a feature of the Gemara to have such a thought process or to go off on a tangent because of how important and essential this topic is for Jewish people to know and to understand. And that, my dear friends, concludes today's study session of Gemara. I hope you join us tomorrow. Yasher koach to all for your questions, comments, feedback. See you tomorrow. Same time.
No,
same place.
it's
Shalom Ber, Rabbi Shalom Ber is going to do Chumash right now. So I'm going to end this link. Please rejoin to study Chumash for today's portion.
Thank you. Shkoyach.